All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the program. My name is Billy Dees, and on the studio line with me is Shaman Isis. Shaman, how are you?
I'm fantastic, Billy. Thanks for having me.
Of course, talking to the live people on X right now. If you've never checked out the program before, first of all, I want to welcome everybody in. We do talk about politics and current events. We try not to have, like a slant. Neither one of us are ideologues, or at least, radical ones. We all have our leanings. We're going to talk about a number of things today. Here again, being live on X, if you want to tweet us something, we may or may not be able to respond to you during the program. But some of us will, Shaman and I will, look at them and respond to some of them if we can. So again, this is, I guess you could say this is kind of like a behind the scenes as we tape the podcast, because I'm about to do the intro and everything like we normally do. You will be able to find this podcast on all the major platforms. My name is Billy D. So you can find the Billy D's podcast pretty much on any of the major platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Good Pods is another one we are on. So you can find us, find my show there. And also, Shaman, you tell them where they can find you before we get started.
Yeah, the Shaman Isis show runs on YouTube, Spotify, Good Pods, Buzzsprout.
All right.
It's everywhere that's major.
Awesome. And she has a fantastic following and well-deserved. So anyway, thank you very much for checking us out. And I'm going to go ahead and get into our program. Hello, everyone. My name is Billy Dees. Absolutely thrilled that you are here. My co-host is Shaman Isis. Shaman, welcome to the program. Always great to have you.
Thanks, Billy. I'm thrilled to be here.
Absolutely. Telling our audience we are live today on X, which is the old Twitter. So if you've had an opportunity to check us out there, I'm very glad you have. The podcast version is available just about everywhere. Thank you very much for listening. We're going to talk about, we originally, when Shaman and I talked about doing the program this week, we were originally going to cover the RFK going independent. And we can touch on that today because I do think that's something that is very important. But by the same token, what has happened now is that story has been overshadowed by what has happened in Israel over the past week. The news cycle the past week has been very difficult, very disturbing. And we're going to kind of talk a little bit about what some of this means. Now, obviously, this touches on politics. And you may or may not agree with everything we are going to talk about today. However, I do believe that this is worth discussing because it's going to impact us here in the United States in one way or another. Maybe more directly than what we can imagine at this time. We simply don't know. It most certainly will have ramifications coming up for the election, how we handle foreign affairs and all these other things that have been going on. So anytime something like this happens, there's a lot of information that's cast out there. And this can come from any number of different sources. It's very hard to dissect what has been overblown, what is real, what isn't, what is being used for political purposes and what isn't. Let's suffice it to say there's a couple of things we can all agree on. That Hamas, which is a terror organization, an extremist group, did launch an attack on the state of Israel. And Israel was victimized in a lot of different ways. There's pretty much no question that innocent people not only got in the way, but were targeted. A lot of them were targeted in terms of being executed. A lot of them were targeted in terms of being humiliated, tortured, and so on. There was a report about some headless babies, which is kind of an odd phrase, a horrific phrase to utter.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were saying that, maybe this is propaganda. And it's certainly possible. Those are things that have to be considered. But over the last 24 hours, it's been documented by enough sources now including state agencies, that this probably did happen. There's certainly no question that atrocities happened. I mean, we can kind of piecemeal out which ones did and which ones didn't, but it's safe to say that some really bad ones have happened.
Yeah.
It also is kind of generally accepted that a lot of these terror groups have taken refuge in different places in the Gaza Strip, Palestine, and so on. And for Israel to make an attack on them, they have sort of a predicament, because no matter what they do, innocent people are going to get in the way, because, quite frankly, a lot of these terrorists have used people as human shields.
Yeah.
Often what they'll do, they'll strike, take hostages or whatever, and barricade themselves in behind the line somewhere, and you have to come looking for them door by door, because if you just hit the area, you're going to kill innocent people. So that's kind of where we're at. What is your initial reaction of this? How have you been taking in the news here the past number of days?
I found it startling and very tragic whenever innocent people lose their lives in such a horrific way. It reminds us of all of the traumas that we've been dealing with over recent decades, and I think it brings a lot of people to a somber place. I would hope for a quick end to the entire engagement, but that's just not normally how these things go. So I've just been sending a lot of good energy out and trying to listen to people who need to talk.
Yes, this has caused a lot of anxiety uh, for people in general, for good reason. Certainly throughout that region, but even here in the United States. Interestingly, I was talking to some veterans, and the images coming particularly from that place in the world where a lot of them have served recently.
Yeah.
This is causing a lot of trauma and triggers for them as well.
Yeah.
Not only because it brings them back to where they were, but there's then the specter that we could get drawn into this and somehow end up on the ground somewhere. That's kind of
Yeah.
where I want to go next. When you have a conflict like this, my dad was very much a Civil War expert. He knew all about the Civil War. So I was exposed to a lot of that when I was very young. I didn't understand a lot of it. But one of the concerns that Lincoln had was when you have a conflict, and it's not really a civil war going on over there per se, but you have a very localized regional conflict going on there with a lot of people around that area that could possibly get involved. One of the things that Lincoln was concerned about was the longer that something like that goes on, more people could get involved, and he was really worried about Britain getting involved and taking up, the cause of the South. That's one of the reasons why he made the issue of slavery a moral issue, because by that time England had abolished it, and he knew the king wasn't going to support a pro-slavery state or country. And it's the same thing happened in Syria here more recently. There was a conflict there. We originally were not going to let that happen. There was what was called a red line that was drawn, but we backed off of that. And now here again, there's so many people involved in what's going on in those conflicts over there that you can't piecemeal them out.
Yeah.
So, what do you believe the chances are, the longer this goes on, that we have Iran, we have any number of different people that could potentially get involved over there? What are your concerns about this spreading throughout the region?
Yeah. I'm concerned that it's going to go on for a period of time as historically it has. And I'm also concerned about it not only, us getting involved and our men and women of the military having to do more, trauma-inducing work. I mean, it is. I mean, although I'm not saying that it's not about helping. It's just about how big this gets, how long it goes on, and how deep we get into it, and if it carries over to here, because the world we live in now it's all about getting attention and making a statement, and so people are willing to do some pretty scary things, wherever they can to be able to get the attention for their whatever they care about. And I think that, that brings in a layer of concern that we haven't had in past a lot of the past wars, because they remained isolated with the open borders and things leaking like sieves, and people wanting to make statements. It has me concerned that we may see something here in this country, on top of getting brought into a serious battle.
Yes, I would agree with that. I am not overly concerned that a major attack in the United States is going to happen. Now, that I want to be clear when I say that, you can't discount it. You can't say, "Oh, that's not going to happen here. That's all being used to scare people." And no, it's possible,
Oh yeah.
and yeah, it's very possible. One of the things I would like to point out, I know that we have this sense of safety here in the United States that could. It's not just what's going on in Israel. Okay, I believe I've mentioned before the hypersonic missiles that China has are a problem for the United States because we
Yeah.
really don't have anything that'll stop them. I mean, you're talking about something that is a huge missile and is going way faster than a bullet. Just like the name implies, hypersonic, many times over the speed of sound.
Yeah.
And my conservatives, I watch, I do a lot of observation online, TikTok and other things. And it seems like, these people that are all gung ho about, getting into a fight,
Mm-hmm.
they seem to think that, Russian soldiers or whatever are going to storm this country, and they're just going to sit in their backyard on their lawn chairs with a 6-pack of beer and a shotgun and shoot them as they run across the yard. That's not how war happens. Okay. No, it's not how war happens, and it's not how it's going to come during this time. And what I mean in this era. The first wave of an attack on the United States would be ones and zeros. The first thing that would happen would be closing down all our communications, closing down the power grids, closing down everything. So if you can imagine waking up one morning in silence, your radio doesn't come on,
Yeah.
TV doesn't come on. You look at your phone, it's dead. You look outside, the street lights aren't working. There's just dead silence. You can't call anyone. You can't get online. You can't do anything.
You're reminding me of what it was like here when 9/11 happened.
Sure. And, this is something that will go on. How do people get medicine? How do people get treated? How do people find out if their loved ones are okay? That's the kind of darkness that it would start. And then after a few weeks of this is when the really bad stuff would start happening. Okay. That's when let's say if it was a state, a sponsor of terror, and there were cells over here, that's when stuff would start exploding. If it was some sort of a country involved, that's when the missiles would start coming in. And that's how it would happen. And if you can imagine, as bad as 9/11 was and Ground Zero was,
Mhm.
if you can imagine the entirety of New York being like Ground Zero was, and millions of people fleeing on the highways, looking up at the sky, trying to determine whether the streaks that are across the sky are planes or missiles.
Yeah.
That's the type of thing that the United States has never dealt with before. And another aspect of this is that our fighting people abroad, even when Normandy was stormed and all this, if you managed to survive that, you could eventually write home. There were limited communications at that time, but there were international phones available. At one time or another, whenever you could check back with the family in Des Moines and know that everything was okay. This is a situation where the fighting people abroad for the United States could be calling home, not knowing if Des Moines is still there.
Yeah.
That is something that our fighting forces have never had to deal with before. Now, I'm here again. I'm not playing the alarmist here, but if one of the, I'll let you, because you're making some expressions, so I kind of want you to pick up if you
Can't
agree or
help
disagree.
myself.
But
Yeah.
I really think that what you have to be conscious of is that our military is pretty strong. It's not as strong as it once was. There was a time when we could pretty easily put 500,000 people, just about in terms of troops and so forth, pretty much anywhere in the world in a relatively short period of time. We can't do that now.
Yeah.
Okay, and you got to keep in mind too that the fighting forces that we have around the world are pretty much designed to protect our allies and our empire, not the continental United States.
Yeah,
So
that's a good point.
yeah, and so there's a lot to consider here. So Shaman, I kind of did a little spiel there. I want you to tell me what your reaction would be.
Um, well, I think we do have to be concerned about things spilling over because the world has changed, and the statement making and desire to shake the world, because it's gone beyond just things happening where the main the core fighting or the core issue, the seed of whatever battle began, and the world that we live in now encourages that on some level, simply because everybody has their own media platform and can instantly get the attention that they want. So there's that. I was here in New York. I worked with the World Trade Center during 9/11, before 9/11, actually leading up to it. And what you described is actually quite similar to what it was like here when it happened. So I've seen the damage that things happening in this country can do, and would honestly say that I am actually more concerned, just intuitively, about lone wolves showing their support for Hamas, if you will, and different people have different opinions, which I try to respect, but the likelihood would be Hamas doing something to drive home their point and get attention, and that actually has me concerned, and that's what happens when other countries support. One side, things like that become a possibility. And I think we have to get to a place where we support our military and being able to address situations like that on a grander scale, because I think that is going to be more common in the future than huge wars will be
Yeah.
the issue of lone wolves.
Yeah, lone wolves are probably, getting back to my concern. I can't at this time expect necessarily a enormous attack the way I described it just a moment ago. I don't anticipate that. But here again, you can't say it can't happen. Don't fall into that trap. The lone wolf thing, typically when we talk about a lone wolf, we might talk about some sort of a mass shooter
Mhm.
or something of that nature, somebody who's like they've had in England and here as well, people wielding machetes and things like that. The lone wolf can be much more dangerous than that. The idea that a nuclear detonation would have to come in on a missile is not true. I mean, you could drive one in the back of a pickup truck and
Oh yeah,
into a crowded city, and a suicide bomber on steroids
yeah.
take a nuclear device in an automobile and light it off. And it used to be in the 1950s, the technology that governed nuclear reactions was very limited to the superpowers and only the best of the best in terms of the scientists. That's not true anymore.
No,
Okay, the
not at
cat
all.
is out of the bag.
Yeah.
Okay, too many people know how those things work,
Mhm.
and the materials are all over the place. The old Soviet Union, the old USSR. My understanding is they don't know where some of those went or whose hands they're in.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily need uranium anymore. I mean, hydrogen and a lot of
Mm-mm.
other things. So will work.
And there's
So
other alternatives, as 9/11 demonstrated, a handful of people, and
yeah,
something that was never, seen before. So yeah.
yeah. So I mean, this lone wolf thing is nothing to dismiss as well. It's going to be isolated and it's going to be small. This is a lone wolf could change the story of change the trajectory of human civilization and how we live in this century. It really could happen. A nuclear detonation in a populated area, and it wouldn't necessarily have to be a big one. But you got to keep in mind that Hiroshima was a relatively small blast in comparison with what's available now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So these are all things that,
And Billy,
yeah, sure.
I have to say, it bears mentioning after the closures with the coronavirus, there are weapons that are far more insidious and silent. I call them silent weapons that can be utilized by people who have hatred in their heart, which frankly brings up like what is the future of ever trying to deal with a situation like that? And it's like, can you get that kind of hatred out of someone's heart and that capability out of someone's heart? And will they ever age out, and allow people to move on and have a different perspective? It's a begs an interesting question.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Before we get in, we will touch on RFK, but I can't believe, as I stated earlier, that either directly or indirectly, what's going on in Israel and throughout that region isn't going to impact the election.
Yeah,
Now,
it already is.
oh, certainly, yeah. Now, I can't. I am saying I'm not a fan of President Biden is an understatement. However, so far, I believe he's done what he can. Okay, you can't expect him to go in there and start a war.
Yeah.
He's been very clear about his support of Israel, which alone is very important because
Oh, yeah.
typically what happens is we state our support in the beginning, and then as the weeks go on and things drag on, then we start, well, maybe. So I just hope it continues. Let me also say here again, we can't confirm. I myself, as an individual, can't confirm some of these stories, but as the best way I can describe the money that a lot of conservatives are criticizing President Biden about now, which had to do with, I believe it was $6 billion that was going to be released to Iran. Okay.
Mhm.
A lot of conservatives are saying that this is financing through the state of Iran what's going on with Hamas and so forth. There's some truth to what the conservatives are saying, and I'll get to that in a minute. As it stands right now, to the best of my knowledge, that money has not been released. That money is not money that the United States has that we are giving to Iran. That was money that, in one way, shape, or form, is theirs. I don't know if it came from oil or what, but it was held up as part of some sanctions.
Mhm.
Okay. And so there might be a debate on whether or not that money should ultimately be released. I believe it's going through the process, however that happens, of international transfers. So I'm not sure if we could stop it or not, but that may be a discussion. So should that have happened? In my opinion, sanctions are there for a reason. And if this was done as part of a hostage thing or something like that, if these reports are true, what concerns me about that is anytime you do that, you put a price on a potential hostage anytime they're taken. So I hope that's not the case. Now, I know that a lot of liberals are taking the things that I just said, that this is not a cash being given to them, and they're running with this and saying that this is something that the right wing is conjuring up to be something more than what it is.
Yeah.
One thing that I would say that I do believe is true is that fudging these types of numbers is very easy when it comes to releasing it, because what you can do is this. Because the argument is that this money hasn't gone through yet, and the money is only supposed to be used for humanitarian needs. And they say that that's locked down, that we are tracking that money. That's what the left says, that money is only going to be used for humanitarian needs. Okay, let's suppose that's true. Here's where I agree with what the conservatives are saying. Shaman, if I'm on drugs and I come to you and I say, look, I need food. Okay, can you give me some money for food? And Shaman, you say, hey, I'm not going to give you cash because you're going to go right out and buy some drugs. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go to the grocery store with you. You can pick out some things and I'll buy them for you. So we go to the grocery store. I pick out, let's say, $300 worth of food, and you pay it. And I give you a big hug out in the parking lot. I say, thank you very much. Now I can eat this month. And you obviously know I didn't spend the money on drugs. I bought the food right here. Now I go
Yeah.
home and go back to my apartment. And what is the situation? The situation is any money that I needed for food is now going to go to drugs because I already got the food. So that
Yeah.
has loosened up my budget to buy drugs. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's
It's almost fruitless.
yes. And so that's why when you say, well, okay, we're going to release this money to them, we're going to let it go, we're going to make sure it goes for humanitarian aid. Here again, that frees up their overall budget to do whatever they want to do with it. That's
Yeah.
the thing.
And areas like that in the world who've been in war or been battling for a really long time, they're like poor areas in this country. If you want to know how to make $100 stretch 10 different ways, you give it to somebody who's had to get creative, and people who've been in war for years are very creative at finding ways to stretch a dollar, if you will. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So, and you said areas of war. That's another thing when we were talking about our readiness. When I was talking about a massive attack or something like that happening here, it's one thing to be prepared militarily, but that's something that the population. You have to understand that. Let's say in Ukraine or in the areas of Israel and Palestine and all these places throughout the Middle East, these are very battle-hardened individuals. Okay, getting up in the morning and hearing bombs go off and having to make your way through a battlefield is pretty much part of a Wednesday morning or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, United States, not so much. Okay,
No.
how
No,
how
people run in the US because they're so unaccustomed to things. They'll either run or they gawk instead of responding. And I'm not saying that everybody's like that, but a huge majority are not accustomed to that level of trauma.
no, no. I at the risk of pissing some people off, I'll tell you that the American public, through generations now, have had it very easy in
Mhm.
comparison with other places of the world. I mean, whether it concentration camps in the last 100 years, within 500 miles of where you live in the United States, hasn't happened. Active battlefield with anywhere in the continental United States with 500 miles from where you live hasn't happened. How many people in the United States have ever worried about their kids going to school in the morning and having to drive around landmines?
Yeah.
Hasn't happened. I could go on with this. How many
We're
times have
soft. We're
yeah,
soft as
yeah.
a country.
How many times has somebody in the United States said something about the president of the United States and they come home and their family's gone? Okay, how
Yeah.
many times? It just yeah. And these are things that just about anywhere else in the world has happened probably within the last 50 years.
And they're not only hardened to seeing it, they're trained to react, or be vicious or act, even before being provoked because of years of being traumatized. They become defensive and begin to try to deal with things before they become a problem. Where Americans just don't, and I'm not talking about our military, I'm just about the average person, doesn't has never even been in a fight,
Yeah,
much less a battle.
yeah, yeah. That is true. And I'm one of them. I mean, I guess I could say the only experience that I've had with it is my father in particular was a very damaged man because of his what he's went through in the service. His brother got killed in combat. He took that very hard. He came from a violent family to begin with. And I saw some pretty scary behavior out of him. He never hit my mother or I, but I'm telling you, he was something else. I mean, you didn't cross my old man.
Yeah.
He wasn't wrapped too tight, and I say that respectfully.
Yeah.
God
Yeah.
rest
I
his
get it.
soul. He had some problems. And a lot of his friends were equally as violent. I mean, these were scary dudes. And I've seen what it can do. I've seen exposure to that kind of violence and what it can do to people. So, here again, it seems like, we're so concerned about our right to spit on the sidewalk. We have no idea what could get taken from us.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I grew up, a brawler, and I mean, I grew up in an orphanage, so I had to learn how to fight when I was young, and, it used to really surprise me when I would meet, a lot of Americans, and they just didn't, they didn't have that experience, and so they didn't look for that kind of thing, and they don't know how to deal with trauma. I think it's one of the reasons why we're struggling with a major mental health crisis and, due to issues like depression and anxiety. That's a whole other conversation, but
yeah.
American people have gotten soft through not having to deal with a lot of the issues that our ancestors had to deal with.
That is true. And, a lot of the people that fought in World War II fought, one of the greatest threats. And I got to tell you here again, somewhat of a student of history. Yes, the Allies did a great job standing up against Hitler, but we also were very lucky that Hitler wasn't just a little bit more sane and actually listened to his advisors, because what he had assembled in the late 1930s was the most powerful military force, as far as its strength against the world forces that had ever been assembled.
Yeah.
And
they didn't question anything.
Yeah. So anyway, okay, it's going to impact the election. And I think in ways that haven't been determined yet. A lot of this, like I said, the resolve of this administration moving forward, how this plays out in the court of public opinion, how much can we tolerate in terms of innocent life being taken on both sides of what's happening. There's a lot of intangibles here. But I think the last thing that President Biden needs is to be seen as a weak president, because he's not perceived as Rambo as it is. So if this turns into some sort of a disaster that spirals out of control, I think it could be really bad for the Democrats. Based on what's happened so far, do you have an opinion about this?
Yeah, I think it's going to prove really interesting because it puts into play within the presidential race an international issue, and it will challenge the experience level of all of the candidates and their ability to be diplomatic and deal with having complex conversations. And so I think it's going to be interesting because it's going to test the mettle of the candidates who have, for the most part, stuck to very domestic issues. And it brings out the presidential and potential presidents. And so I think that for, it just in and of itself is going to be very interesting.
Yeah. We originally were going to do this podcast in the wake of Robert Kennedy, Jr., of course, Bobby Kennedy's son and the nephew of the assassinated president, the son of the assassinated candidate in 1968. So he has gone independent. He has separated from the Democratic Party. I'm kind of, I don't know what to make of this. I'd have to see what some of the polling indicates. Initially, the gut reaction is, well, being that he's a Democrat and he's probably from one of the most famous Democratic families in the United States.
The most famous.
Yeah, the most famous Democratic families in the United States. That he's going to take away Democratic votes, which could hurt them in the general election. But you know what? I'm not so sure, because I don't think Republicans are gung-ho about a lot of their candidates either.
No.
To say the least. I don't think
any of them are gung-ho about any of their candidates, which is what makes him such a threat.
Trump has a base. I'm not sure how powerful it's going to be in the general election. That's yet to be determined. Although I have said recently on this podcast that 3 or 4 months ago, I would have said that Trump can't win in the general election. I wouldn't say that now. Yeah. I'm not saying it's likely going to happen, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility. If you look at some of the polling, he's winning against Biden now. Now, this was before the Israeli conflict. But what's the dynamic with Robert Kennedy going rogue, so to speak? What do you think what dynamic does that bring to the election?
Well, I think it was the best thing that he could have done. I think it adds spice to an election that was already pretty spicy. I think it was probably the smartest thing he could have done, and I would be very surprised if it was not something they had planned already and knew they were going to do. Make sure you establish the base within your own party, and then put yourself in a more viable position. Which I think was what they did. They were smart about it, and now he's in the best possible position he could be in to be a real threat. I think he's more of a threat than Ross Perot was.
Yeah,
and he got like 17% of the vote, and if Trump and Biden continue to have faux pas moments, who knows what could happen. I think it could be the first time we have a real viable candidate that is an independent that could possibly end up in the White House, and I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I would say it's still just a little too early to tell, but I think he's off to a very interesting start. He was overshadowed this week by the war, of course. But I have a feeling once the end of the year starts to draw closer in 2024, that starts to come up on the calendar. That's when things are going to get really interesting. And I'm going to say I think Robert could be a very interesting independent candidate. You know, you mentioned Ross Perot, and I'm old enough to remember this, and I always did follow politics, even when I was young.
Yeah,
most
me
young people
too.
don't,
Yeah.
but I did. You know, I grew up in the Reagan era, in 1980s.
Mhm.
That's when I started working and doing things, and I got to say, I believe that had Ross Perot stayed in a three-way race and didn't back out, if you recall, he backed out.
Mhm.
And it was some kind of BS thing about how the Republicans were going to ruin his daughter's wedding. I
Yeah.
mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. Okay. And even at that point, I was on the, listen, we got to get the toolbox out and fix it. That's right. You know,
That was the story that was used. I
yeah.
don't believe for a second that was the story.
Yeah, we got to get the toolbox out and fix it. Say, the sooner we start, the sooner we'll finish. Thank you very much, and God bless America. Okay, that was and you know what? I went for that.
Yeah.
Okay, but once that thing started, then he got back in, and he could never get to where he was because the people didn't trust him.
Mhm.
And I believe if he had he stayed in,
Yeah, I agree.
it could have changed history. I'm not saying it would have,
It
but it
could've.
could have.
Yeah, I
And
remember this very well because I was like, "What are they doing? They just lost all that rope."
yes, yeah. So, Shaman, in closing here, the only thing I would say is to the American public is I don't know what's going to happen here. It's a scary time for our veterans. A lot of my friends who have served have been shook up because this is from an area that they've just been in.
Oh, yeah.
You know, when they
It
see
just
this
the whole
footage,
thing
they were
reminds
just
them.
there.
Yeah.
So and it's a scary time for our public. For the public. The only thing I would say is remain vigilant. You know, as much as you may not like to follow the news, follow it. It does make a difference who we vote for. It does make a difference who we vote for. So stay in it, but don't let it consume your life. You know, there's a certain amount of, there's only so much you can do anyway.
Mhm.
And you have to enjoy life. You have to take care of your mental health. You have to take care of your family. You have to go to work and pay your bills. These things aren't going away.
Yeah.
So don't get too consumed in this to the point where it's harming your well-being. At this time, there's not an imminent threat that I'm aware of or that's been made known to us, a credible one anyway. So you just have to listen to local authorities, listen to your local news, and be vigilant. But you know, enjoy life, enjoy the opportunities that you have here in America and around the world. There's a lot of good places in the world, and it's so easy to get focused on the trouble spots and the harm that they could
Yeah.
bring. Just keep your life in balance. Shaman, do you have any words on that?
Yeah, I would hope that if anything on the positive comes from this issue is that, the corporate greed that is really breaking the back of the American people, um, steps back because something's gotta give there, and when something like a huge crisis comes up on an international scale, it can sometimes, have that effect, and I would just hope that that would be one of the things that actually comes out of a situation like this, and I would say to people, focus on, um, creating a good life for yourself, and, we become the content we consume, so if you're consuming fear-driven content, you will take on that energy. Try to be very selective about the information that you take in, and get it from, people who, or websites or whatever it is, whatever your resource is, that you've looked into and discovered, have good roots and where they get their information from, because we really do become the energy of the content we consume. So make it good content.
Absolutely, those are great points. You know, become the content that you consume. Shaman, are you covering any of this on your podcast? Any of these events?
Yeah. Yeah, I am. Definitely. Yeah.
And you want to tell people your video is frozen at the time, but that's okay. We can hear you fine. Would you want to tell people where we can find you?
Absolutely. You can find my podcast, books, and workshops and course on my website, shamanisis.com. And there's links to both my audio and video podcast there, shamanisis.com. Thanks, Billy.
Well, thank you. You've been listening to the Billy D's podcast. Again, you can find the Billy D's podcast pretty much anywhere podcasts are found. And as far as social media goes, you can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter. I've been on Twitter a long time. If you go to Twitter, you'll see my link tree and a bunch of other places that you can find me, all the platforms the podcast is on, as well as the social media that I maintain. So until next time, I want to thank everyone for listening to our podcast today, and we will talk to you again next week.
You are listening to the Billy D's podcast. Follow Billy D's on Twitter, now the X platform, @BillyD's.